Attention, people of Earth and world history. It's now time for Mr. Owen's Lecture. I hope you got your thinking caps on today, kids. I got my big brain on. Let's get started. This is for Eastern Uprisings and the collapse of the Soviet Union. All right, let's do a quick review. Remember where we're at? The Cold War is in full force. You got stuff going on all over the world. Stuff's happening in Latin America. You got proxy wars. You got the Eastern Bloc, which is in Eastern Europe. Russia has created what's called satellite countries, and they basically control these countries, use their farmland, all that kind of thing. And the United States has formed a group called NATO to protect themselves, and they are racing in everything. They are racing in the Olympics. They are racing in space, and that is one of the biggest races they have is the space race. And remember that Russia or USSR is the first to launch into space. They're the first ones to get a satellite in there, and it's called Sputnik. When they get Sputnik up, is this an embarrassment to the United States? The United States responds by creating a company to work on space-related things. You know it today as NASA. And NASA gets into full force, and the United States ends up becoming the first country to make it to the moon. And the USSR and the USA go back and forth, competing over space. Also have what's called an arms race. And they are competing back and forth for arms, and they are trying to show superiority. Who can have the most nukes? Who can have the most guns? Who can have the most tanks? They do this to ensure that if one attacks the other, they'll be protected. It's called ensured destruction. You attack me, I'm going to blow you up bigger and harder, so don't do it. That's kind of how this works. And the weapons also work to fund the proxy wars that we've been talking about. The Vietnam War, the Korean War, and all these other proxy wars in Latin America that Russia and the United States don't directly fight over, but are actually fighting over. That's why it's called a Cold War and not a hot war. All right. This arms race, though, is actually, and the space race, is actually going to eventually lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union because they cannot keep with the spending of the United States and it is going to bankrupt the USSR. Basically, they're not going to be able to get the common essentials and necessities. So in other words, they got plenty of guns and tanks, but no food. So it's nice to have a gun and tank. Remember in World War II, this was the country that didn't even have enough guns for each soldier, and you would run in a line, and if you're USSR and your guy got shot in front of him, and you would pick up the gun, and then you would keep running, and when you got shot, the guy behind you would pick up the gun. Now they had plenty of guns, but no food. In fact, when they collapsed, they literally were paying some of their citizens in potatoes instead of their money, which is called a ruble. Can you imagine going to work and then getting your paycheck and it's just a sack of potatoes? I don't think you'd be too happy either. Now it's time for Pop Culture Fact. All right, here is your Cold War pop culture fact. And it is a comic book fact. And any of you that have heard of the Fantastic Four, it is a very popular comic book written by Jack Kirby and the great Stan Lee. Fantastic Four, as the popular depictions of the Cold War were about to shift toward the absurdist and ambiguous, in came Jack Kirby and Stan Lee's iconic superhero team. Figures of space race, daring do, who were pitted against Central European dictator Victor von Doom. It's been said that the Fantastic Four are inseparable from the Cold War origins, but even in 1961, they represented an era of national ideas and scientific wonder that was soon to vanish. So crazy, but yes, the Fantastic Four and many other types of pop culture that you've known to love were created as a direct result of the Cold War. Mind blown, right? All right, so we move on. We've done our little review, little catch up. Hopefully you're taking some notes. All right, so Stalin's going to die. All right, yay, USA stoked. In comes a new guy. All right, his name is Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev. How do you spell it? Boom, look at the screen. This guy is super famous, and boy, does he hate the United States. In fact, there's even a famous meeting with the world leaders where the United States and them are arguing, and all these world leaders are around, and this guy stands up, he takes his shoe off, and slams his shoe on the table, and he goes, "We will bury you!" Yes, he does that. One of his most famous moments. And he's going to come in there and realize how bad Stalin screwed things up. And he's going to do a thing called de-Stalinization. Say it with me, children. De-Stalinization. There it is. That's how you spell it. Okay? They're going to figure out that Stalin killed 20 to 50 million of his own people. He was brutal. He abused his power. So they remove some of his statues. They take the gulags, which were their prison camps, their labor camps, and they're going to improve the conditions. And they're going to start some political reforms. Okay, they're going to reveal his crimes to the people of the USSR, and they are going to purge him from history, which is super ironic because if you remember, Stalin purged a ton of people from history and even had people photoshopped out of pictures and eliminated. And so now he gets eliminated from history. And the response is a ton of the satellite countries that the Soviet Union was overseeing, like Czechoslovakia, start to protest these atrocities, and they want new freedoms. For example, the Hungarian Uprising of 1956, and the Hungarians demand changes to Soviet policies. They say, we want change. What happens? The USSR sends their military in, and they crush the opposition in the Hungarian Uprising. Also in Czechoslovakia in 1968, there's a thing called the Prague Spring. Prague's the capital of Czechoslovakia. It's a beautiful country. Yes, I've been there. Absolutely glorious if you ever get to go. Prague Castle is breathtaking. And they want new ideas. They want freedoms. And the USSR military goes in and crushes the rebellion. Later, there's a Polish uprising. The Polish people say, we want new freedoms and ideas. We demand change. And guess what? There's a reoccurring theme here. The USSR comes in, and guess what? Yes, you guessed it. They have the military smash the uprising. Okay? And that is going to continue. And eventually, towards the very end, when the Soviet Union finally does collapse in 1991, they're going to have a ton of uprisings, including some in the USSR itself and throughout its dominion. And they're going to get pretty upset. Now, it's time for a Did You Know? Did you know? The Soviet Union actually fought a war in Afghanistan. They decided to expand their territory into Afghanistan, and they were very appealing to some because they give women's rights in communism and they share wealth. Well, that's great for some in Afghanistan, but for Muslims, the idea of bringing in values towards women and bringing in more freedoms and anything against their Muslim religion was not okay. They saw this as a holy war, and they fight a major war in the 80s with the USSR, and the United States sees this as an opportunity for a proxy war. They come in, they fund the rebels, and this is really going to drain the USSR and their money, and it's going to hurt them big time. But ironically enough, you have to be careful when you get involved in a proxy war because the United States trains a guy named, did you know? Did you get it right? Osama bin Laden. Yes, that's right, people. He was trained by the United States, funded by the United States, and when the proxy war was no longer beneficial to the United States, they pulled out. This would anger Osama bin Laden, and eventually he would look down upon Western civilizations and societies and see them as a threat to Afghanistan, and eventually lead to the September 11th bombing. Another mind-blowing fact, right? Crazy how history can be tied together, people. Come on, if I haven't done my job of connecting everything, I'm absolutely mad, right? I'm already wearing a mad hat, so let's do this. All right, we keep on moving. Time for a Cold War fact! All right, Cold War fact. Did you know, have you ever heard of the term Third World? You probably thought it referred to a poor country. You were wrong. Today, that's kind of what it means, but originally that's not what it was supposed to mean. Originally, it was supposed to mean anybody that wasn't siding with the United States or the USSR during the Cold War. So, for example, India, the United States was like, hey, be our ally. India's like, no. The Soviet Union's like, hey, we'll be our ally. India's like, no, we want to sit this thing out. We don't want to be a part, we don't want to be on either side. So they got labeled a third world country. And you're like, all right, fine. If you're not going to be part of our team or their team, you're the third team, you're third world. And as time went on, this got to be known for impoverished countries because the USSR, USSA wouldn't really trade with them. And it did affect these countries. So that's where the term third world comes from. Crazy, right? All right, we keep moving. So after Nikita Khrushchev makes all these changes, he slams his shoe on the table. He dies and a new guy takes over. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev. All right, how do you spell it? Boom, it's on your screen. Mikhail Gorbachev. All right, now this guy is going to eventually lead to the Soviet Union's collapse. And if you look at the early 1980s and throughout the 1980s, the Soviet Union seemed, by all accounts, to be really strong and doing very well. Google action movies from the 80s, and I'm telling you right now, almost every action movie, whether it's a Bond flick or whatever, is going to be against a Russian. Like, that's just how it is. Look at Rocky IV. Rocky Balboa, Sylvester Stallone fights a Russian guy. Look at Arnold Schwarzenegger. There's even an action movie he does where he's actually a Russian commando guy that fights an American cop, and they're on this investigative thing. There's all these crazy movies because this thing is at its peak and it's going crazy. Berlin is still divided in half through a Berlin Wall, and things, as far as we know in Russia, seem fine. And it's going to be mind-blowing when this whole thing falls apart. And Mikhail Gorbachev is going to start this thing with two things. One is called Glasnost, and the other one is called Perestroika. Okay? They're on your screen. Take a look. That's how you spell them. Okay? Perestroika actually means restructuring. Okay? And Glasnost is going to basically mean to encourage citizens to seek political reform. Now sink that in for a second. Restructuring and encouraging citizens to seek political reform in a country where in previous years, if you spoke out against the country, you took a bullet to the head or went to a gulag. This is a game changer. And people are like, wait a minute, things suck and we can say they suck? And Gorbachev's like, yeah. And people are like, well, they suck. So this is going to start breaking up the Soviet Union because it's going to encourage honesty and political discussions, and it's going to really bring open to light some of the atrocities of the government and how poor they're doing. Okay, and it's going to get the people to want the government to take action and to do better. You know. All right, boom, Cold War fact. This is a Cold War pop trivia fact brought to you by Mr. Owen. In April of 1972, Pepsi becomes the first American product available in the USSR. Isn't that crazy? Nuts. It took all the way for 1972 for them to have a Pepsi. Craziness. All right, we move on. Okay, so these reforms are going to spread into the satellite countries in Eastern Europe. And the satellite countries are like, well, we're really not happy. Can we get out of this? And eventually, Gorbachev's going to say, you know what? If you guys want out, just say so. And they're like, yeah, we want out. We can say so? And he's like, yeah, just say so. So they're like, yeah, we want out. So then they get free. And then Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, gives this famous speech. And he says, Gorbachev, tear down those walls. And he's referring to the Berlin Wall. And they tear down the Berlin Wall in 1990. And that comes down. And then that is a huge moment, and in fact, I have a video for you to watch on that. Please, if you're going to watch any of the videos, they're all really short, and I've picked some magnifique, amazing videos. It's probably 20 minutes worth of videos, and you're going to love them. They're really good. One of them is the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it's actually a news clipping live of it actually happening, and you're really going to get a kick out of it. Okay? This is a big deal. Remember, we're in 1990 now, so this is like 10 years before most of you were born. So, I mean, you guys should start to really, really care about the decade before you're born because now this is really going to influence. Okay? All right. So, after this happens, things get worse and worse for the USSR, and I've put up two videos for you. One is just kind of a 5-minute explanation of exactly why the USSR falls, and another one is live news coverage, again, of it falling. I've also got two really funny videos. One is anti-US propaganda, and it's funny how the Soviets saw us. They saw us as fat Americans who are all about the stock market and just greedy, greedy, greedy. And then there's an anti-USSR video from the American government that's all cartoons and blasting communism. So hopefully you get a kick out of those. You don't have to watch the whole thing. You can fast forward through them, but they're really kind of funny. But definitely watch the ones that talk about the fall of the Soviet Union. And on December 26, 1991, like you'll see in the videos, the world is like mind blown and the Soviet Union collapses and it's completely dissolved. It's the end of the Cold War, baby. Gorbachev resigns. He quits. He's like, I'm done. Okay. They create all these independent states. Boris Yeltsin is going to become president. They're going to try democracy. And Boris Yeltsin's going to come in, and they had the right idea, and unfortunately for the Soviet Union that now becomes Russia, the Soviet Union no longer exists, now you have Russia again, Boris Yeltsin is a crooked slob and a terrible president. Sometimes it's forgotten that the United States' first president, George Washington, wasn't just a great president, he was a great human being, and he did a really, really good job. Boris Yeltsin is the opposite of George Washington. He's terrible, he steals, he stinks. So they're going to try democracy, and they're not going to like it a whole lot. And then there's this guy that's going to come into the picture, and his name is Vladimir Putin. He's a former Russian spy. He's going to take over Russia as their quote-unquote president. And 20 years later, he's still in charge. And now he's looking like he's trying to seize power as a complete dictator, which he really has been. Honestly, it gets kind of confusing. So I've posted a video for you. It's only a couple minutes, but it explains the Soviet Union since the collapse and going into Russia. If I were to sit here and explain the Russian government today to you, I would probably take me an entire afternoon. It's confusing. It's weird. They're like some weird communist, socialist, democracy, dictatorship hybrid that's very confusing. If you don't believe me, Google it. It'll make your head spin. All right, but basically that's where we're at today. And the United States and Russia had good relations, and they're slowly but surely disappearing. And I can make a very strong argument that the Cold War is back on. I've included an article for you. A few years ago, Russia invaded Ukraine and took a piece of Ukraine for themselves. The world didn't do much other than a slap on the wrist with some financial sanctions. They told them, stop doing that. Sound familiar? We've done that in the history before. But they did it. They took it. We let it happen. And now you're starting to see some proxy wars. Most recently in Syria, Russia was heavily involved, and so was the United States on opposite sides. And you also have some stuff going on in Venezuela with Russia on one side and the United States on another. So we'll see what happens. We have stopped a nuclear agreement pact that we did after the end of the Cold War, where we were going to stop making nuclear weapons, and we're now making nuclear weapons again. Russia has tested several that are supposed to be pretty intense, and that's where we're at today. So it's pretty crazy how history can repeat itself. We have to kind of be careful. I hope you've gotten a lot out of this. I hope I've covered everything in its entirety. Again, go check out these videos. I have some really, really cool videos for you. I don't just pick the first video I see. I do a lot of research, and these videos are cool because a lot of them are news clips. So take a look. If you have any questions, message me. I hope you enjoyed the pop culture trivia, and I hope you have your big thinking cap on. Have a great rest of your day. Let me know if you need anything. Go crush this test.